What's going on, everyone? Scott here. Welcome back to the channel. So it is finally time. We finally have the full bracket for the men's side of things for March Madness in the NCAA tournament. Now, just looking at everything, a lot of interesting draws and potential matchups down the line to look at, especially in the East region. Not just because this is usually a Michigan State channel, as you can see, but yeah, the East region definitely with some potential matchups, Hall of Fame matchups as well. But definitely, I think, too, we'll get in here more in a second. I think there's definitely some injury and availability concerns for the East region overall. Arizona, I think, just kind of looking at it, I think has a decent path to to a Final Four. That Midwest region, I think, is wide open. Obviously, that school down the road, they're the number one seed in that region, and for a reason, they deserve that. But I do think it's kind of wide open for the most part. And then the South region, I think, is setting up for a big time matchup, a big time national championship rematch from last year as well down in the South. But we're going to go through, just give our kind of initial thoughts on the whole bracket as well. Some notes I wrote down, as kind of going through things here. And then, yeah, later in the week, we'll obviously dive way deeper into the bracket overall and each region as well. And then obviously Michigan State side of things, we'll have a Michigan State, preview for their first round matchup as well. But anyway, before we do jump in, if you could just hit that like and subscribe button down there. As I said, we'll have way more NCAA tournament stuff on the channel throughout this week. We're going to go through, break down each region of the bracket here, both the men's side and the women's side as well. Just got that bracket as well. We'll have another video up on the channel right after this, talking about that bracket, kind of initial thoughts as well. And then, of course, we'll fill out our full bracket later in the week too, before we get to the first round games on Thursday. Obviously got to play in later, or earlier in the week, should I say. But just make sure to subscribe. A bunch of stuff will be on the channel, so just make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a video. So we'll just start up in that East region. And number 1 overall seed, Duke, well-deserved, versus 16 seed Siena. Then 8th seed Ohio State versus TCU. I think that's an interesting matchup. 8 versus 9. I think Duke gets by pretty easily, obviously. In that one, I know there's been 116 upsets, but I don't see any in this field. But Ohio State TCU, I think, is very interesting because Ohio State, Bruce Thornton, the way he could score the ball, and the way that Ohio State kind of played, they gave that school down the road run for their money on in the NCAA tournament on Friday. So I'm interested to see Ohio State get out of there. I think Ohio State will get out of there, but I do think Duke will have trouble with Ohio State. I think Bruce Thornton finally getting in the NCAA tournament definitely can cause some problems. You move down, St. John's versus Northern Iowa, the 5 versus 12. That's always a popular one, but I got Rick Pitino. I like him in that matchup to set up. You got Kansas versus Cal Baptist. I think Kansas versus St. John's. So you got Bill Self versus Rick Pitino. Storylines galore, obviously, just part of it there. Then you got Louisville and South Florida. South Florida, a popular pick for a handful of people already. And then our Michigan State Spartans versus North Dakota State in that 3 versus 14 matchup. And then we'll just kind of finish out here, UCLA and UCF in the 7-10 game, and then UConn versus Furman, 2-15. Now for Michigan State, well, first off, overall, we talked about, just kind of the storylines coming out of this region. It's obviously a Hall of Fame, type of region with the Hall of Fame coaches. Obviously, Tom Izzo, you got Bill Self, you got Rick Pitino, you got John Shire, who will probably get there one day as well. You got Dan Hurley, who is on his way there as well. So incredible stuff overall, but you're setting up some incredible potential matchups as well. We already talked about potentially, St. John's and Kansas, Rick Pitino versus Bill Self, but then whoever wins that game as well, potentially seeing Duke in that Sweet 16, a Duke versus Kansas, Duke versus St. John's, Duke versus Rick Pitino, kind of that storylines. Those storylines come out immediately there. Michigan State, if they're able to get out of the first weekend, then, you could potentially see a Michigan State versus UConn rematch from the exhibition game earlier this year that Michigan State went to UConn and played their tight game but ended up losing. But I think, too, I'm going to go through just a couple notes I wrote down. Obviously, I said Ohio State, maybe they could be a potential team. I think Duke gets by and gets to the second weekend, obviously. But I do think Duke is an interesting 8 seed to watch in that second round matchup. Not picking them, but I do think that's an interesting matchup. As I said, potential Michigan State versus UConn rematch. You could also see Michigan State versus UCLA rematch, which I would love to see that as well. felt Michigan State played absolutely horrible on Friday. Would love kind of a rematch there if both teams were able to win to that point. But I said this was the Hall of Fame region as well, but I also think this is the health/availability region as well. With UCLA, Donovan Dent, Tyler Bilodeau in the Big Ten tournament got a little banged up. Kansas, the availability, Darren Peterson, whatnot. Louisville, Michael Brown Jr. What's his status? Duke, with obviously their big injuries. Will they get their guys back as well? So a lot of big names in this region, but I think there's a lot of question marks potentially too. But yeah, just kind of first glance at this, I do think the possibility of getting an Elite Eight of Michigan State versus Duke in Washington, where that 2019 game was as well, the Cassius Winston, the Xavier Tillman game against their, Zion Williamson, RJ Barrett, that incredible Duke team and what Michigan State was able to do in that one. That was an Elite Eight game in Washington, D.C. again. That would be absolutely incredible to potentially get that. But obviously a long way to go for both teams there. But UConn, do they kind of turn things around with a couple of tough losses late in the season there, and obviously losing in that Big East final to St. John's. But UCLA, too, I think is a sneaky team as a 7 seed. If they are healthy, we saw what they were able to do to Michigan State on Friday and able to do in the Big Ten tournament overall. But I mean, Donovan Dent, he's really coming along late, especially over the last couple weeks. Tyler Bilodeau, if he's healthy, he's one of the better bigs in the country, could step out, hit the 3 and whatnot. So I think UCLA is an interesting 7 seed right there. But I do like a potential Duke-Michigan State matchup in the Elite Eight here. But yeah, I definitely think this is for Michigan State too. We'll get in more in the Michigan State centric video, but I think Michigan State falling to a 3 from a 2 seed line. But this is what I wanted. I wanted Michigan State to fall to a 3 seed in the East region. I would much rather have that than having stayed a 2 seed and have to go out west and play in some of those matchups as well. So I know that's an unpopular opinion in Michigan State circles right now, but I would have much preferred this draw. With that being said, we'll go over to the West region with the number 1 seed Arizona versus number 16 Long Island. Got Villanova, Utah State in the 8-9 game, Wisconsin and High Point in the 5-12, and then Arkansas, Hawaii in the 4-13, and then BYU will be playing the winner of the Texas versus NC State game. That's an interesting one. I think BYU gets out of that game either way. I think BYU has a chance to make a run here. I got initial looks. I got BYU going to the second weekend. I got them upsetting Gonzaga in the second round. At the bottom of the bracket, Missouri, I think, is an interesting team there. I did pick Miami in the ACC tournament, but I do kind of think Miami gets there to set up 2 versus 10 with Purdue, but I think Purdue gets out, setting up BYU Purdue in that Sweet 16 game up top. Wisconsin and Arkansas being the 5 and the 4 there. Absolutely hate that. If they were in different regions, I was probably putting them both through to at least the Sweet 16, if not further, because Wisconsin's guards and Nick Boyd, John Blackwell, absolutely love them. Guards win you games in March, and they show you just that, the way they can score the ball and everything that they can do. We've seen how tough they were in the Big Ten tournament and how tough of an out they were in the Big Ten tournament. And Arkansas with Darius Acuff, he's one of, I said this kind of earlier, it might be kind of hot takey right now, but is Darius Acuff maybe John Calipari's best guard? I know he has a lot to choose from, but whoever wins that matchup, I think definitely has a chance to upset Arizona in the Sweet 16. But at the end of the day, I still do think, I've said it for a couple months now, Arizona has been my national championship pick from, before we even got to midseason. And I see them coming out of this region, but I do think it can be interesting, though, for them. We'll head down to the Midwest. Number 1 seed, that school down the road, will play against the winner of the play-in game from UMBC and Howard. Now, I would love a UMBC rerun of that Cinderella story in this 116 game. Probably not, though, but I do think injuries could catch up to them. That LJ Kaysen injury, as I kind of said here at the top, I think definitely, could potentially catch up to them. Probably not in this first game. Potentially in that second game, though. We have 8 versus 9, Georgia versus St. Louis. Robbie Avila, St. Louis, he's an interesting matchup. Could that be a potential, upset in the second round? I think so. Kind of where I'm leaning right now. Take the bias out of it, but with how good they look. But as I said, healthiest teams usually win in March. And I think that injury can come back to bite them and get them kind of at some point. So yeah, I think St. Louis can make a second weekend out of that top part there. Texas Tech versus Akron in the 5-12 game. I got Akron winning that game. Alabama versus Hofstra. I think Alabama gets on, and I think Akron's an interesting team to get to the second weekend there, but I think Alabama ends up getting through. Tennessee will play the winner of the Miami, Ohio versus SMU game. This is the interesting one. I think Miami of Ohio wins the play-in game, and I think they beat Tennessee in that game to go ahead and play the winner of Virginia versus Wright State. And then you got Kentucky versus Santa Clara. This one's kind of up in the air for me. I'd like to pick Santa Clara, but I think Kentucky probably gets a game out of here. And then Iowa State versus Tennessee State for the 2-15 matchup. I think this bottom part of the Midwest bracket is very interesting, and I think that it's wide open. Right now, I'm probably leaning towards Virginia coming out of here, but Iowa State, can they put it together, do it in March? Can Miami of Ohio? Could they be an 11 seed that makes a run? I think Miami of Ohio is kind of the lowest seed here that, or the highest seed, however you want to say it, lowest seed that can make a run. I could see them making a second weekend here. I think they could potentially make a second weekend. Right now, I'm kind of leaning Virginia to come out of here to go to that Elite Eight, and depending on what happens up top, I'm kind of leaning Bama right now. It could very well be that team down the road. Could very well be them. And, they've rolled teams all year, but there's some stuff there that, we see them just got beat on Sunday. So, I think the Midwest region is wide open, as I said at the top. With that being said, we'll move over to the South, the last region. Number 1 seed Florida will play the winner of Prairie View A&M and Lehigh. Then you got Clemson versus Iowa in the 8-9, Vanderbilt versus McNeese, Nebraska versus Troy. Nebraska, obviously, big storyline from everyone, looking to win their first NCAA tournament game in history. Got 6 seed North Carolina versus 11 seed VCU. A lot of people on VCU early. I know the Caleb Wilson injury, obviously, for North Carolina is a big concern. Don't think they're going to make a second weekend here. I think they get out of this first game, though. But Illinois versus Penn. So Illinois versus Fran McCaffrey, Brad Underwood, Fran McCaffrey, rematch from old Big Ten days. St. Mary's versus Texas A&M. Then Houston versus Idaho. Listen, at the end of the day, coming out of the South region, obviously Florida has played really incredible this last stretch of the season. They lost, obviously, to Vandy in that SEC tournament. I think they do get us another shot at Vandy there in the Sweet 16. I think Florida does come out of there, though. From the bottom part, I think Illinois, if they can, get enough stops, put stuff together, I think we can see a Sweet 16 versus them in Houston. I do think Houston probably comes out of there, and we see Houston versus Florida, but I think that Illinois versus Houston game will be very entertaining. But I think at the end of the day, Elite Eight from this side of things, Florida versus Houston, I think Houston can get out of there. So that's kind of just some early thoughts. Early on, I kind of like looking at the Elite Eight because I feel like Final Four, that's obviously where you're working towards to get. But right now, kind of early on, we'll obviously dive through further, make our official predictions later this week. But Elite Eight from the East, I like Duke versus Michigan State. From the West, I like Arizona and wow, that's tough. Arizona versus BYU or Purdue. I think those teams will win on to the Sweet 16. Whoever wins that matchup, I think they got going against Arizona. I think Arizona gets through either of them anyway. The Midwest, I think that it's going to be Alabama versus Virginia at the end of the day. And I could see that being a coin flip game in the Elite Eight to get to the Final Four. In the South region, kind of just said it. I think it's Florida and Houston. I think Houston gets through. So early on, Final Four, I think Michigan State, Houston. On the other side of things, I believe Arizona versus Virginia, maybe. Yeah, Virginia. I'd like to say Alabama, I think, kind of. But I think Virginia kind of gets it done there. So that's kind of my initial thoughts. the Final Four and kind of the bracket. Like I said, I do think there's some potential for some pretty big upsets. I said, St. Louis potentially a 9-1 in that second round. I said Akron over Texas Tech. Miami of Ohio, as I said, I think will beat Tennessee as well. But now I guess kind of lastly here, before we end this, the most likely seeds I want to talk about. Most likely #1 overall seeds to lose the first weekend. And I think there's only two teams that are at risk of losing the first weekend. I'm early on picking one team to her #1 overall seed to lose the first weekend, but I think the biggest matchups right here. You look at a potential Duke versus Ohio State matchup. That's a potential with Bruce Thornton's ability to score the ball and some of the other pieces that Ohio State has around. I think that's an interesting matchup. I could definitely see that happening. I don't think it will, but that's a potential. The only other one I think is that school down the road losing in that second round. We've seen Georgia be good at times this year, but I think St. Louis, as I said, I think is good enough to make a second weekend from that 9 seed. If any, like all these 1 seeds very well, just get to the second weekend and keep it moving. I don't think all of them at the end of the day will make a Final Four, but they can all definitely get out of this first weekend. But Duke and the school down the road, I think, are the two most likely, given their matchups. Not anything to do with their teams, really. Both of those teams have injuries, concerns, but I think Florida, really, I don't think much concern. I think they have a fairly easy Sweet 16 path. Arizona, I think, same thing, fairly easy Sweet 16 path overall. I think that Sweet 16 game versus probably Wisconsin or Arkansas, I believe, I think will be very interesting. But yeah, that's kind of just where we think so far. As I said, we will be back later on this week to break down each region individually and then give our picks for obviously the whole thing. We'll fill out our bracket here overall, but yeah, as I said, that'll do it for this one. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a video. A ton of content on the channel all week long, but thank you all so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Peace out.